The cold was a living thing. It had teeth that bit through leather and wool, and a breath that stole the warmth from a man's bones. It was the kind of cold that killed livestock where they stood and turned the ink in a man's pen to a solid block. 40 below zero, the mercury frozen at the bottom of the glass, and for 2 weeks it had not moved. It was this cold that drove Arthur Sterling from his own hearth, his face wrapped in scarves until only his eyes were visible, crusted with ice. He carried a heavy burlap sack filled with salted pork and hardtack, a grim offering for the dead. The younger man beside him, Thomas Miller, carried a lantern, though its light seemed small and frail against the vast, blue-white emptiness of the snow-covered plains. Their destination was a small, dark shape against the horizon, the widow's cabin. She had been alone since her husband, Johann, had succumbed to a lung fever in the late summer, and Sterling had seen her meager woodpile dwindle to nothing before the first real snows had even fallen. No one had seen smoke from her chimney in a month. He and Miller were not going to check on her, they were going to recover a body. They expected to find her wrapped in every blanket she owned, a frozen statue in a silent, icy tomb, her German shepherd a loyal, frozen sentinel beside her. The wind howled, scraping snow across the hard crust of the prairie. Sterling pounded a gloved fist on the cabin door. The sound was flat, swallowed by the immense silence of the cold. He waited, then pounded again, harder. "Anya," he shouted, his voice muffled by the cloth. "It's Sterling. We've come to help." He expected no answer. He was already planning how they would force the door without damaging it too much. Then, a sound from within. A bar being lifted. The door creaked open a few inches, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. It was Anya. Her cheeks were pink, not the waxy pale of frostbite. Her eyes were clear. Beside her leg, the German shepherd, Kaiser, looked up at them, his tail giving a slow, questioning thump against the floor. Sterling was speechless. Miller lowered his lantern, his jaw slack. Sterling finally managed, his voice thick with disbelief. We were worried." No smoke. Anya looked at him, her expression unreadable. She opened the door wider. "The cold is deep," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Come in." They stepped across the threshold, bracing for the frigid air of a dead house. But what met them was not cold. It was warmth. A deep, penetrating, impossible warmth that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the cabin. Sterling stomped the snow from his boots and felt it not on his soles, but through them. He looked around. There was no roaring fire in the hearth, only a bed of pale, slumbering embers behind a small iron plate. There was no stove. There was no pile of wood. He looked at Miller, who was staring down at his own feet with an expression of utter bewilderment. He knelt, pulling off a glove, and pressed his bare palm flat against the wooden floorboards. They were warm. Not just free of chill, but actively, undeniably warm, like a sun-baked stone in high summer. He looked up at the widow, at her calm face and the watchful dog at her side, and the question hung in the warm, impossible air of the cabin. How? Their arrival had been one of hope, a stark contrast to the grim present. They had come in the spring, when the prairie was a sea of green and the sky was a vast, benevolent blue. Anya and Johann, with a wagon containing all their worldly possessions and a dream of land that was truly theirs. He was a man of broad shoulders and a quiet, steady competence, she, a woman whose hands, though slender, were never idle. They had papers for a section of land marked by a sluggish creek and a single, gnarled cottonwood. It was not the best land, others had said, too exposed to the north wind, the soil thin near the rocky rise behind it. But it was theirs. They worked from sunup to sundown, building the cabin with logs they felled and shaped themselves. Johann had a knack for it, fitting the timbers with a precision that left no room for the wind to sneak through. Anya chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and dried grass, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm. They spoke little of the old country, of the life they had left behind, but its memory was in their movements, in the way Johann tested the heft of an axe, in the way Anya could judge the weather from the color of the sky. They were a self-contained unit, a partnership that needed few words. The community, such as it was, watched from a distance. Sterling had ridden out once, offering a hand, but Johann had politely refused. "We must make it our own," he had said, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Sterling had understood it as pride, the fierce independence of a man determined to stand on his own 2 feet. He left them with a nod, but also a sliver of concern. The prairie was a harsh partner, and it did not care for pride. Kaiser, then just a lanky pup, would patrol the perimeter of their small homestead, a furry shadow darting between the stacks of fresh-cut lumber. By late summer, the cabin was complete, a sturdy, one-room testament to their shared labor. They had a small garden, a pen for a few chickens, and a sense of accomplishment that was as real and solid as the roof over their heads. But the prairie gives, and the prairie takes. The fever came on suddenly, a dry, rasping cough that quickly settled deep in Johann's lungs. Anya nursed him with broths and herbal teas, the same remedies her grandmother had used, but this was a new world, and the sickness was relentless. He was gone in a week, his last breath a shallow whisper in the pre-dawn quiet. Anya sat with him until the sun was high in the sky, her hand on his cooled one, Kaiser's head resting heavy on her lap. The silence he left behind was immense, a physical presence in the small cabin they had built together. When Sterling and Miller came to help her with the burial, they found her composed, her grief a tightly guarded thing behind her pale, dry eyes. They dug the grave on the small rise overlooking the creek, and spoke the few words they knew over the simple wooden cross. The advice came swiftly, wrapped in sympathy but edged with a stark, practical fear. "You cannot stay here alone, Mrs. Strauss," Sterling had told her, his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder. It was a week after the funeral, and the first hints of autumn were coloring the edges of the prairie grasses. A winter in this place, it takes 2 strong backs just to feed the fire. You should sell the claim. Move into town. There's work to be had as a seamstress, or in the boarding house. Miller's wife had come with a basket of bread and preserves, her eyes full of a pity that felt heavier than any hardship. "Mr. Sterling is right," she'd murmured, patting Anya's arm. "It's no place for a woman on her own. The loneliness is one thing. The cold is another. It is a killer." Anya listened to them all, her hands clasped in her lap. She looked around the cabin, at the sturdy walls Johann had raised, at the small window that framed the vast, empty land that was supposed to be their future. Leaving felt like a second death, a betrayal of the sweat and hope they had poured into this soil. When they were gone, she stood on her small porch and looked out at the landscape. They saw a threat. They saw an enemy to be endured. She was beginning to see something else. She saw the creek bed, not just as a source of water, but as a repository of smooth, flat stones, worn by millennia of patient current. She saw the clay bank, a deep, rich red, exposed where the water had cut into the earth. She saw the rocky outcrop behind the cabin, a spine of ancient granite pushed up from the prairie floor. Her mind drifted back, not to Johann, but further, to her grandfather's house in the old country. It was a place of harsh, unforgiving winters, much like this one. But his small cottage was always warm. She remembered as a child, lying on the floor, the gentle, radiant heat soaking into her small body through the thick woolen rugs. He had no grand fireplace that roared and consumed whole trees in a night. He had a stove. A great, hulking thing of brick and clay that took up one whole wall, which he called a cachalofen. He fed it only once or twice a day, with a surprisingly small amount of wood. The secret, he had told her, tracing the path with a calloused finger, was not in the fire, but in the smoke. "You do not let the heat escape to the sky," he'd explained, his voice a low rumble. "You make it work. You make it travel. You trap its warmth in the stone, and the stone will be your friend all through the night." Anya looked from the creek to the clay bank, and then to the cabin. An idea, born of desperate memory, began to take shape. It was a wild, audacious plan. It would mean tearing apart the very home she had just finished building. It would be back-breaking work, work for 2 strong men, not one lone widow. But the alternative was to run, to admit defeat, to let the cold claim Johann's dream. She went inside and pulled a heavy storage chest from under the bed. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, were Johann's tools, his saw, his hammer, his chisels. And beside them, her own tools, a heavy trowel and a spade. She picked up the spade, its wooden handle smooth and familiar. Kaiser watched her, his head cocked, as she walked to the center of the room. She took a deep breath and drove the blade into the floorboards. The act felt like a desecration. The clean, smooth planks of pine that she and Johann had so carefully laid were now being pried up, one by one, with a screech of protesting nails. The scent of fresh-cut wood was replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the ground beneath. It was cold, a deep, cellar-like chill that seemed to cling to her ankles and creep up her legs. She worked by the light of a single kerosene lamp, its glow casting long, dancing shadows that made the small room feel vast and menacing. Kaiser whined softly from his spot on the bed, the only remaining island of familiarity in the disrupted space. Anya ignored the cold, the splinters, the ache that was already settling into her lower back. She stacked the floorboards neatly against one wall and then began to dig. The ground was hard-packed, a dense mixture of soil and clay that fought the shovel at every turn. She was not merely leveling a space, she was excavating. First, she dug a deep, rectangular pit near the existing hearth, a space that would become the firebox, the heart of her new system. It needed to be low, almost entirely below the level of the floor, a sunken chamber where the fire could burn hot and fast. From this pit, she began to carve a series of long, winding trenches, channels that snaked back and forth under the entire footprint of the cabin. It was a mirror of the pattern her grandfather had once drawn for her in the dirt, a serpentine maze designed to force the hot gases from the fire on a long, slow journey. Each shovelful of earth was a monumental effort. She filled buckets and hauled them outside, creating a growing pile of dark soil that steamed in the crisp autumn air. The work was slow, methodical, and utterly exhausting. Days blurred into a rhythm of digging, hauling, and collapsing into a brief, dreamless sleep, only to rise before dawn and begin again. She ate sparingly, stewing one of the chickens with the last of the vegetables from her garden, making the meal last for days. Her hands, once merely calloused, became raw and blistered, then healed into thick, tough pads of skin. She grew thinner, her face etched with fatigue, but her eyes held a feverish, unwavering resolve. Sterling rode by once, his horse shying away from the strange mound of earth beside the cabin. He saw the gaping hole where the door had been, covered only by a hanging blanket. He called her name. Anya appeared, her face smudged with dirt, her dress stained. "Just making some improvements before winter," she said, her voice flat, offering no further explanation. Sterling stared at the pile of dirt, then back at her. He saw not a woman improving her home, but one descending into a grief-stricken madness. He thought of Johann, a sensible man. What would he think of this? "The first snows will be here soon," he warned, his tone heavy with a mixture of pity and exasperation. "This is no time for digging." Anya simply nodded, wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty wrist, and turned back inside. The blanket fell, closing off the view. Sterling sat on his horse for a long moment, then shook his head and rode away, now more certain than ever that the widow would not survive the winter. With the trenches dug, the second phase of her impossible project began, gathering the materials. This work took her out of the suffocating confines of the cabin and into the sharp, clean air of the advancing autumn. Every morning, she would walk to the creek, her wheelbarrow bumping along the uneven ground. The water was already icy cold, and she would wade in, her skirt hitched up, her bare feet turning numb in seconds as she searched for the right stones. She needed flat, smooth ones, not the round, tumbled rocks that were most common. They had to be of a relatively uniform thickness, to serve as the walls and caps for her network of flues. Each stone was a small victory. She would load the wheelbarrow until she could barely push it, her muscles straining as she navigated the path back to the cabin. The pile of stones grew slowly, a grey cairn of her relentless effort. Next was the mortar. She returned to the clay bank she had identified, hacking out great chunks of the dense, red earth with a pickaxe. She hauled it back, bucket by bucket, and mixed it in a large wooden trough with sand from the creek bed and dried grasses she had scythed from the prairie. She added water sparingly, kneading the mixture with her hands and feet, feeling for the right consistency, just as her grandfather had taught her. It was a thick, heavy paste, a primal sort of cement that would hold the stones together and, once fired, become as hard as rock itself. The assembly was a painstaking process, a form of subterranean masonry. Down in the cold, damp trenches, she began to build. She laid a foundation of the thickest stones, then began constructing the walls of the channels, each stone carefully selected and set in a bed of her clay mortar. The firebox was first, a brick-shaped chamber lined with the most robust stones, designed to withstand the highest temperatures. From its top, she engineered a single opening that led into the serpentine flue system. The first channel ran the length of the cabin, then doubled back on itself, running parallel to the first. The maze continued, back and forth, a long, winding river of stone that covered the entire area beneath the floor. It was a puzzle of angles and joints, all designed to keep the smoke path sealed and to maximize the surface area that would absorb the heat. She worked by lamplight, her world reduced to the narrow trench, the feel of the cold stone, and the smell of the wet clay. Kaiser would often lie at the edge of the excavation, his nose resting on his paws, a silent, furry overseer. She spoke to him, and to Johann, and to the grandfather whose memory was her only guide. The smoke must not be rushed, she would whisper to the stones, pressing them into place. It must linger. It must give up its warmth before it is allowed to rest. The work was precise and unforgiving. A single gap, a poorly sealed joint, and the cabin would fill with smoke, rendering the entire system a failure. Day after day, she laid the stones, her progress measured in feet, not yards, until finally, the last channel connected to the spot where the chimney would rise. The maze was complete. The chimney was the most critical and complex part of the entire structure. A conventional fireplace chimney was a simple, vertical shaft, designed to draw smoke and heat up and out as quickly as possible. Hers had to do the opposite. It had to provide just enough draft to pull the smoke through the long, convoluted path she had built, but not so much that it pulled the precious heat along with it. The smoke that eventually exited her chimney would be cool, having surrendered the vast majority of its thermal energy to the stone mass beneath the floor. She constructed the base of the chimney on the exterior wall, using the sturdiest stones and the thickest mortar. It rose not from the firebox itself, but from the very end of the serpentine flue. This design meant the fire was pulling, not pushing, the exhaust gases through the system. It was a delicate balance of physics and intuition. As she worked, laying the final courses of stone, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, fat, wet flakes that melted on her shoulders and hissed on the warm stones of the hearth she had yet to extinguish. The sight spurred her on, a stark reminder that her race against time was nearly at its end. Once the chimney was capped, she turned her attention back inside. The maze of stone channels lay open, a bizarre, subterranean sculpture in the middle of her home. Now, she had to seal it. She began laying the largest, flattest stones across the tops of the flue walls, creating a solid, continuous surface of rock. Each one was heavy, and she had to wrestle them into place, ensuring a tight fit. She sealed every seam and joint with a final, thick layer of her clay mortar, smoothing it with her trowel until the entire area was a single, monolithic slab of stone and earth. The final step was to put her house back together. She retrieved the floorboards she had so carefully stacked against the wall. They felt alien in her hands now, light and fragile after weeks of handling solid rock. She laid them over the new stone subfloor, nailing them back into place. When the last board was set, the room looked almost as it had before. The only visible changes were the new stone hearth and the small iron door she had salvaged from an old cookstove to cover the opening of her firebox. The cabin was whole again, but transformed from the ground up. Outside, the snow was beginning to stick, blanketing the prairie in a thin layer of white. The mound of excavated earth was a dark island in a growing sea of white. Her woodpile was still pitifully small, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the few who passed on the distant track into town. She had enough wood for a week, perhaps two, of conventional heating. She prayed it would be enough for a winter of her grandfather's way. The air in the cabin was cold and heavy with the smell of damp clay and curing mortar. With a trembling hand, Anya took a few pieces of kindling and a handful of dried brush. She opened the small iron door to the firebox, laid the fuel inside, and struck a match. The first fire was small and hesitant. A plume of thick, acrid smoke puffed back into the room before the draft caught, and for a heart-stopping moment, Anya feared she had failed. That a critical joint was unsealed, or the chimney design was flawed. Kaiser sneezed, backing away from the hearth. Then, with a gentle whoosh, the smoke reversed course and was pulled into the dark opening, disappearing into the belly of the earth beneath her feet. She held her breath, listening. There was no sound, no rumble of a great fire, only the faint crackle of the kindling from deep within the stone chamber. She added a few small logs, pieces of wood that would have been consumed in minutes in her old fireplace. She closed the iron door, leaving a small vent open for air, and waited. An hour passed. The cabin remained cold. The floorboards were as icy as they had been that morning. Doubt, a cold and creeping thing, began to seep into her bones, more chilling than the winter air. Had it all been for nothing? A mad folly born of grief and desperation? She sat on the edge of her bed, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, and watched the small iron door, her hope dwindling with each passing minute. Then, she felt it. It was not a blast of heat, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The chill began to recede, not from the area around the hearth, but from everywhere at once. She slid off the bed and knelt, pressing her palm to the floorboards in the center of the room, far from the fire. There was a faint, deep warmth, like an echo. She moved to the far corner, the coldest part of the cabin, and felt it there too. It was working. The stone mass was a slow, giant battery, absorbing the intense, focused heat from the small fire and releasing it gradually, evenly, over its entire surface. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine smile in months. It was in this moment of quiet, weary triumph that a sharp knock came at the door. It was Agent Davies, the man from the Territorial Land Office. He was a man with a thin face and eyes that saw everything in terms of regulations and property lines. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze sweeping the room, his nose wrinkling at the smell of the curing mortar. "Mrs. Strauss," he began, his tone devoid of warmth. "I've had reports. Concerns from your neighbors. They say you're unprepared for the winter." His eyes fell on her tiny woodpile, visible through the window. "They appear to be correct. This claim requires the land to be actively improved and maintained. A lone woman, with no resources, living in squalor." He gestured vaguely at the signs of her recent labor. "It does not meet the spirit of the Homestead Act. I am prepared," Anya said, her voice quiet but firm. Davies gave a short, cynical laugh. "With what? Hope? This is not a game. People die out here. The territory cannot be responsible for you. I am issuing you a formal notice. You have until the spring thaw to demonstrate that this claim is viable and that you are capable of sustaining it. If you cannot, the claim will be forfeit." He placed a folded paper on her small table. He did not feel the warmth rising from the floor. He saw only a destitute widow in a disordered cabin. He saw a problem to be managed, a piece of paper to be filed. "Good day, Mrs. Strauss," he said, turning to leave. The cold blast of air that entered as he opened the door was a reminder of the battle she was facing. It was not just against the winter, but against a world that had already written her off. The deep freeze came not gradually, but like a hammer blow. The temperature plummeted overnight, and the world awoke to a stillness that was profound and terrifying. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp pain in the lungs. The sky was a pale, merciless blue, and the sun was a distant, useless coin in the heavens. For the settlers scattered across the prairie, it was a time of siege. In the Sterling household, the great stone fireplace, the pride of the ranch, devoured logs at an alarming rate. Arthur and his two sons were in a constant cycle of chopping and hauling, yet the corners of their large main room remained frigid. The windows were opaque with thick, feathery frost. Mrs. Miller, in her smaller, newer cabin, wept as she huddled with her children around their cast-iron stove, feeding it precious wood while the wind rattled the walls, seeking any crack or seam to invade. Every household was an island, locked in a desperate, fuel-guzzling battle against the monolithic cold. But in Anya's cabin, a different reality prevailed. The outside world had vanished behind a wall of white. The wind shrieked and moaned, but inside, a quiet, steady peace reigned. The warmth was constant. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a roaring stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that radiated from the floor, turning the entire cabin into a single, temperate zone. Anya fed the firebox only twice a day. In the morning, she would open the iron door to find a bed of glowing coals from the night before. She would add a few small logs, the driest, most seasoned pieces she had, along with tightly packed bundles of dried brush and even clumps of peat she had dug from the creek bank in the autumn. The fire would burn intensely for an hour or two in the superheated chamber, a contained inferno pouring its energy not up a chimney, but into the sprawling stone mass beneath her feet. For the rest of the day and all through the night, the stones would release that energy, a slow, steady exhalation of warmth. Kaiser, who in previous, milder cold spells would curl into a tight ball, now slept stretched out on his side on the floorboards, his paws twitching in some contented dream. Anya moved about her small home with an economy of motion, her tasks simple and life-affirming. She baked small loaves of bread on a flat stone she placed directly on top of the hearth, the heat so even and reliable it cooked them perfectly. She mended her clothes, the needle moving easily in her nimble, warm fingers. She would sit for hours in her simple rocking chair, the gentle warmth rising around her, and watch the frost patterns bloom and grow on the window panes, not as a threat, but as a beautiful, crystalline art form created by the meeting of her inner warmth and the world's outer cold. She was not just surviving, she was living. She had not conquered the winter. She had made peace with it, using its own principles of slowness and mass to create an island of enduring life in a sea of frozen death. The shrieking wind was no longer a monster at the door, but a distant song, a reminder of the quiet, revolutionary comfort she had built with her own two hands. The knock on the door, when it came, was a shock, a sound from a world she had almost forgotten. It was 2 weeks into the great cold, a period in which no sane person traveled unless they had to. Anya rose, her movements calm, and slid the bar. The sight of Arthur Sterling and Thomas Miller was jarring. Their faces were pinched and raw with cold, their eyebrows and beards thick with white frost. They looked exhausted, like men who had been fighting a long, losing battle. She saw the burlap sack in Sterling's hand and understood its purpose. They had come for her body. They had come with charity for the dead. Her quiet invitation for them to enter was met with a stunned silence, followed by their clumsy, disbelieving entry. The moment they were inside, the change in their demeanor was immediate and profound. They stood blinking, their bodies reacting to the sudden, shocking absence of cold. Miller fumbled with his lantern, his eyes wide as he looked around the room, searching for the source. Sterling, the pragmatist, the man who understood the brutal calculus of winter, so much wood for so much heat, was utterly baffled. His gaze settled on the hearth. The fire within was nothing, a handful of embers. It was an impossible equation. "Where is your fire?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Anya gestured to the small iron door. "It is there." "It is enough." Sterling shook his head, a gesture of complete denial. "Enough for an hour, maybe. Not for 2 weeks. Not in this cold. We've been burning half a cord a day just to keep from freezing." He took a step further into the room and stopped, his boots firmly planted on the floorboards. The sensation was undeniable. The warmth was coming from below, a steady, radiant heat that was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He knelt, just as he had in that first moment of discovery, and pressed his palm flat against the wood. It was real. The heat, Anya said softly, seeing the question in his eyes. It is not wasted to the sky. It lives in the stone. She led him to the hearth and pointed. The fire is here. But the chimney is there. She gestured to the far wall. Sterling followed her gesture, his mind struggling to comprehend the implication. A firebox in one place, a chimney in another? He looked back at the floor, and suddenly, a dim understanding began to dawn. The smoke. The heat. It wasn't going up. It was going sideways. It was going everywhere. "Under the floor," he breathed, the words coming out as a puff of vapor, though the air was warm. "You built it under the floor." Anya nodded. A long path for the smoke. The stones drink the heat. The floor gives it back. Thomas Miller, who had been silent, finally spoke. "My children," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Their hands and feet are covered in chilblains. We keep the stove so hot the metal glows, but still, the cold gets in." He looked at Anya, his expression shifting from pity to something akin to reverence. "How did you know how to do this?" Anya looked at her hands, at the calluses and healed-over blisters. "It is an old way," she said simply. "From a place where winters are long, and wood is not to be wasted." Sterling stood up, his face a mask of awe and dawning realization. All his warnings, all his pity, all his certainty of her demise, had been based on a world she had refused to inhabit. He had been trying to help her survive his winter. But she had brought her own. The thaw, when it finally came, felt like a great, collective exhalation across the prairie. The iron grip of the cold loosened, the snow softened, and the creeks began to flow once more. The cost of the deep freeze was tallied in grim numbers: lost cattle, ruined supplies, and in a few outlying claims, human lives. But from the story of the Great Cold, a new legend emerged. It was the story of the widow's cabin. It traveled from ranch to homestead, whispered in the general store and discussed over church socials. They called it the warm floor, a piece of seeming witchcraft performed by the quiet, foreign woman who was supposed to have been winter's easiest victim. First came Sterling. He arrived not with sacks of provisions, but with a pencil and a sheet of paper, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Mrs. Strauss," he said, his tone stripped of all its former condescension. "Would you teach me?" Anya led him inside and, with a piece of charcoal on a spare plank of wood, she sketched the design. The sunken firebox, the serpentine flue, the relationship between the mass of the stone and the efficiency of the burn. She explained the principles as her grandfather had explained them to her, using simple, direct language. He listened, rapt, asking sharp, intelligent questions. He was a man who understood building, and he recognized the brutal, simple genius of the design. Others followed. The Millers came, and then their neighbors. They would stand in her cabin, their boots on her warm floor, and listen as she explained the process. She showed them the scars on her hands, the pile of leftover stones, the clay pit by the creek. She hid nothing. The fear and pity that had once surrounded her were replaced by a deep and abiding respect. She was no longer the poor widow, the object of charity. She was a source of knowledge, a keeper of a wisdom their own relentless push forward had caused them to forget. That spring, Agent Davies returned, his ledger in hand, ready to foreclose on the claim. He found Anya not alone, but surrounded by her neighbors. Sterling was there, and Miller, and half a dozen others. They were digging a new trench, not at her cabin, but at Miller's. Sterling straightened up as Davies approached. "She's demonstrating the viability of her claim, Agent," Sterling said, his voice firm. "By improving not just her own land, but the entire community." Davies looked from the group of working men to Anya, who stood watching them, Kaiser at her side. He saw no destitute woman. He saw a leader. He saw a survivor whose resilience was now being woven into the very fabric of the community. He quietly closed his ledger, tipped his hat, and rode away without another word. The cabin stood as a testament, its small chimney puffing a lazy, cool wisp of smoke into the vast prairie sky. Anya had not just built a home, she had built a future. She had taken the memory of the old world and used it to tame the new, proving that sometimes, the most profound innovations are not leaps into the future, but rediscoveries of a long-forgotten past. The warmth in her floor was more than just heat, it was the enduring glow of resilience, a quiet, unshakable victory against the cold.